let's take a look at some lovely ladies. For the second video of Yu-Gi-Oh! Month, we're going to be taking a look at one of the staples of the franchise, the female leads. Like the Rivals video, I'll be going over the 5 female leads across the first 5 series of Yu-Gi-Oh! And for the sake of consistency, I'll be referring to them by their English dubbed names. Except Yuzu, because I'll be damned if I have to refer to her as Zuzu when I get to her section. God, what was 4K thinking? Also, I'm obviously not going to be covering Aoi from Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains because at the time of this video's writing, only 2 episodes have aired and she hasn't had a major role in either of them. So, we'll start off with our first character, Taya Gardner, or Anzu Mazaki in the original version. Now, I'm going to be blunt here folks, Taya kinda sucks. Throughout Duel Monsters, she's been nothing more than a glorified cheerleader, an obligatory love interest, and an occasional damsel in distress. Granted, Duel Monsters does have enough cheese to put Craft out of business, but most of the cheesiest lines have come from Taya, mainly because of how much she prattles on about friendship.
I know marker ink will eventually fade away, but it doesn't matter because this ring is never going to vanish in our hearts. Remember our ring of friendship? Nothing can break that bond, so snap out of it, Joey, please!
Yeesh, that sounded like it belonged in season 1 of FIM. However, Taya's characterization may be because of how the series was marketed. As discussed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Overrated, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a shonen series, meaning that its main demographic was young boys. Back then, most folks, especially in Japan, didn't think that girls would be much into buying trading cards unless the designs were like Pokemon, which was comparatively cutesier. And while there were some exceptions, the majority of the monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Back then were far from cute, and the ones that weren't even worth using. So I suppose that could be a possible reason for why Taya's character wasn't as complex or as interesting as some of her successors, but at the same time, explanation is not justification. Still, while it's not saying much, she is a better character than Tristan, and I can't say that she's the worst female lead because, well, we'll cross that busted rickety bridge when we get to it. So yeah, Taya's trash, but at the same time, it can be argued that they weren't aiming that high with her to begin with. Once the franchise started gaining traction though, Konami noticed that there was some interest from the female crowd, even if it was a small amount. And that brings us to our next lady, Alexis Rhodes. Known as Asuka Tenjoin in Japan, Alexis had a much different introduction than Taya. Instead of the best friend that's known the protagonist since childhood, Alexis was a top freshman at Duel Academy, being part of the Obelisk Blue dorm, a dorm that you can't get into as a freshman unless you went to a prep school or had high recommendations. So before we even saw her duel, we knew that she meant business. In other words, she had presence. Alexis was a character that existed separately from Jaden. While she was his ally, her role wasn't dependent on him. She had her own goals to achieve, and it's satisfying to see those goals come to fruition. Even when she becomes possessed by the Society of Light, she's still a formidable opponent and isn't taken down easily. So even if she did technically have to be rescued, she was still a badass while she was a captive. Now the problem with Alexis lies in that she isn't really used all that much. She was more prominent in the first half of the series, but once the Society of Light arc ended, she kinda just phased out of the spotlight. Don't get me wrong, she was present, but she was more of a background character than anything. And if I had to pinpoint a cause for this, I'd say it was due to the primary weakness of GX as a whole. It's too damn crowded. Now, all the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series have relatively large casts, but the less important characters come and go as we move into later arcs. With GX, however, they just stuck around, all vying for a spot as a secondary character. By the time we got to season 3, Alexis had to compete with Hasselberry, Aster, Jesse, Axel, Jim, Adrian, Marcel, and especially Blair, who had momentarily taken the spot as main female because of her arc with Marcel. And the sad thing is that as irrelevant as Alexis became, she didn't even get the worst of it. Poor Zane, you didn't deserve to be kicked to the side, especially when you were a much better rival than the one Jaden had. Alexis was a character with a great setup and had a lot of potential, but once the second half of the series came around, she just faded away. Would the next female lead be an improvement and avoid this pitfall? Why, yes. Well, mostly yes. Let me explain. In 5Ds, we had Akiza Izinski, or Aki Izayoi for the weebs. Akiza is unique in that she's the only female lead who's introduced as a pseudo-enemy rather than a friend, and her alignment remains ambiguous until she finally joins her fellow signers halfway through the Dark Signers arc. I've said before that Akiza and Jack were the standout characters of this arc, and I stand by that. Her involvement with and defection from the Arcadia movement was a major part of Season 2, and her second duel with Yuzu was one of, if not the most emotional duel of the series. And on top of all that, she is fine. Like Alexis, Akiza was a character all on her own. While Yuzu and Jack were having their grudge match, she had her own conflict going on, both within herself and with Sayer. And because she didn't join the Signers after her first defeat, it made her unpredictable. What would it take for her to join up with them? What would she have to go through? And seeing the answers to those two questions made for a great ride. Alas, once we got to the World Racing Grand Prix, Crow had replaced Akiza as the tritagonist of 5Ds. While her role as one of the Signers acted as a safety net to keep her from being completely shafted, since she is needed to complete the group, she was still significantly less important than she once was. Still, while she didn't finish as strongly as she started, she was still a great character and one of my favorites in 5Ds. And again, she is fine. Up next we have... Tori Meadows, also known as Kotori Mizuki. I'm gonna save us all some time here. Tori is straight up terrible. I will defend Zexal to my last breath, but Tori? There ain't no defending you, girl. This girl does literally nothing throughout the entirety of the Zexal series. Just looking at her duel record gives me secondhand embarrassment. She only dueled in 2 episodes, one of which she was possessed in, and didn't even win a single game. Even Taya, who only had 3 duels total, still won some. In fact, she won all of them. So this would mean that Tori is even worse than Taya. How can you be worse than trash? While non-duelists can provide great support to the main characters, Tori doesn't do that. She's nothing more than a bystander. In short, Tori was one of the worst things about Zexal. I'd say she was wasted potential, but that would imply that she had any to begin with. So, moving on to Arc 5, we have our final leading lady, Yuzu Hiraki. Frankly, I didn't think much of Yuzu when I first saw her. I was low-key expecting her to be Tori 2.0 with the way she was designed, but when she ended up beating Yuya in episode 2, I thought, damn, this chick ain't messing around. She was a force to be reckoned with, and at times she was a more interesting character than Yuya himself. Yuzu had more potential than any of the other female leads, and she grew stronger and stronger as she learned more about fusion summoning. And then we got to Season 4. After her loss in the Friendship Cup, Yuzu was tossed to the sidelines. Notice a trend here? The sad thing is that Yuzu had the biggest fall from grace because instead of becoming a background character or becoming less important than she used to be, she went from being a strong female lead to a damsel in distress in a matter of episodes. Once she's taken captive by Duel Academy, the rest of the series becomes about rescuing her and her other dimensional counterparts. Yuzu went from 100 to 0 so fast that it almost feels like she became a completely different character. And while Arc 5 is tentatively my favorite series, because I still haven't finished it and the ending could change how I feel, she was probably one of the biggest disappointments of the series. Still, even when she was good, she was really good. And that does count for something. So, looking back on these 5 girls, what's the main takeaway here? I think it's that the writers should be more careful not to drop the ball with their female leads halfway through the story, as they don't end up shining as brightly as they could have, at least the ones that are actually worth a damn. As far as ranking these ladies from best to worst, I'd put Akiza at the top, then Alexis and Yuzu tied for second, then Taya, then Tori way at the bottom. I'll remain cautiously optimistic about Aoi as I watch Vrains. She does have an interesting bio, so it's gonna fall on what the writers do with her, so we'll just have to see where that goes. In the next video for Yu-Gi-Oh! Month, we'll be going over the main protagonists of each series and seeing how they stack up against each other, so look forward to that. What do you think of the female leads in Yu-Gi-Oh! Who's your favorite? Swarm that comment section below or bug me on social media. And consider supporting me through Patreon or PayPal art commissions. Until next time, keep it sketchy, folks.